All right, guys, so today we're gonna go over 6.6 Duramax diesel versus the 6.7 Power Stroke diesel, Ford's diesel engine and General Motors diesel engine. And these trucks specifically are 2024s. This is gonna be on a 2024 and newer diesel truck right now. And what are the differences here? What are the specs? And ultimately, which one should you buy? Let's start with the General Motors with the GM 6.6 Duramax diesel. So guys, this engine is a 470 horsepower, 975 pound-foot of torque. It's what this engine displaces, what it puts out. And you know, again, I should say this up front on both of these trucks. These are monsters. These trucks have more than enough horsepower, more than enough torque. You're not gonna get in either one of these trucks and be disappointed in that capacity. So the differences we talk about are relatively minor, and it really isn't, you know, none of these are deal breakers, but it ultimately is just, hey, again, it's the comparison. These are both, you know, Ford and General Motors. They're competing with each other constantly. These are the two top of the line diesel trucks. These are the two best selling diesel trucks in the United States. You know, the GM 2500, 3500 Duramax, the Ford F250 and F350 Power Stroke. So ultimately, all right, so 470 horsepower, 975 pound-foot of torque. Fuel economy on this truck would be, you know, again, and that's, I say this relatively because it does depend on how you drive, of course, but 14 to 15 mile per gallon city, 17 to 21 on the highway. And again, depending on what you're towing, guys, I have towed, and I tow a lot with these GM 2500 Duramaxes. You will get, and I get pulling a 8,000 pound camper, I'm getting 7 to 9 mile per gallon, pulling my 8,000 pound camper at 70 to 78 mile an hour, you know, on the highway around town. That's totally different. So they're not strong in that regard, right? When you put some weight behind them, any diesel truck will, you know, lose a ton of fuel mileage, fuel economy. So that is, again, a thing. Now, when we get over to the Ford, you're gonna see, and there's a reason I'm pointing that out, because the Ford numbers do look a little bit different in that capacity. So that's the Duramax diesel. Guys, the other thing that I want to get into is some of the issues, right? So with these trucks, 2024 and newer, they are seeing some map sensor issues, all right? And one of the things I read on that is they recommend you pull the map sensor out every 5,000 miles, every oil change, and clean it, right? Because again, the most common issues with these trucks are sensors. It is the technology. That's the stuff that goes wrong. The engine, transmission, the actual powertrain, hey, there is some issues, but it's not major. It's not super major. That's why General Motors puts a 5-year, 60,000 mile warranty on the powertrain, because they ultimately know, hey, the powertrain is gonna cost us less money to basically cover for longer versus the technology, which they only put a 3-year, 36,000 mile coverage on. All right, guys, if you enjoy watching this content, be sure to hit subscribe, turn those notifications on. It helps us if you guys hit the subscribe button, trying to hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year. So again, we appreciate those clicks. DEF system, also some issues there, but you're gonna have it in any of these diesel trucks, right? So, and then guys, the other thing I wanted to get in on is the actual design of this engine. Again, and I'm talking a constraint with this truck, because when General Motors designed this engine, it is a V8 diesel. It's a Duramax 6.6 liter V8 turbo diesel, right? And what is pretty common here is that you have an engine that's over square. And what I mean by that is, so this engine, the stroke is 3.89 inches, the bore is 4.05 inches. So you are over square, right? Basically, you have a shorter stroke than bore on this truck. And what that means is you have less natural torque. And that is where, when we get over to the Ford, they win out the diesel truck segment, because they have a V8 turbo diesel engine that is under square and puts out a lot more natural torque, which again, when we get to those specs, you'll see that the Ford engine has more horsepower and torque. So anyhow, constraint with the design on this truck is, you know, first off, why did they do that? I'm sure they had a reason behind it, but in the day and age we live in, where it is super competitive and they're competing with Ford, they're competing with Ram, that is something here, guys, that with this truck, these Duramax diesels have the shortest stroke out of any big diesel truck. And because of that, they are torque limited, right? So basically, you know, again, you can modify the trucks, you can do all that stuff, but from factory, they are torque limited. Do I complain about that when I drive these trucks? No, and honestly, and I'll be completely honest, the GM diesel is my favorite truck to drive. And the reason that is because the engine transmission pairing is super smooth. The smoothest driving diesel truck in my opinion, and the smoothest riding diesel truck in my opinion. And a lot of that, guys, is because the General Motors 2500, 3500 trucks have independent front suspension, where the Ford trucks have a straight axle, basically, a solid axle. So the Ford trucks, you will find when you're driving them, a little bit more wander going down the road, where at GM, it rides more like a car. They're 2500 diesels, 3500 diesels, they ride more like a car. The handling is best in class, in my opinion. And that, in my mind, makes up for the, you know, little bit less horsepower and torque, not underpowered by any means, but compared to the Ford, a little bit less, right? So the other thing, guys, is max towing on this GM truck, on the Duramax diesel is, and this is conventional, is 22,500 pounds. The max payload is, wow, 3,979 pounds, okay? So max payload, 3,979, max towing, 22.5 on the GM truck. The Ford truck, for instance, guys, let me get right into this. The max towing on this is 23,000 pounds, and the payload is 4,323, right? So again, this is max. This is not saying that these two trucks I'm looking at right now have that. That's the max available. So Ford has, you know, 500 pounds more of max conventional towing and about 400 pounds more payload available, okay? Total payload available. And the other thing, so getting into the Ford, guys, this is the standard output power stroke diesel. This engine puts out 475 horsepower, so 5 horsepower more than the Duramax, and 1,050 pound-foot of torque. Again, and that's like 85 to 90 more pound-foot of torque than the Duramax diesel, and that is their standard output. Now, Ford, in 2023 and newer, you can get the high output motor, which blows everything out of the water. That's 500 horsepower and 1,200 pound-foot of torque. So if you get their high output motor, that is an absolute monster. That's an animal, right? So that's the Ford specs, the standard Ford specs, right? And again, so while we're getting into this, the one thing I wanted to get into is if we're talking, you know, again, issues with these trucks, maybe a flawed design, maybe something that's questionable. The one thing I found interesting is that Ford still uses the Bosch CP4 fuel pump, okay, that General Motors and Ram stopped using. And Ford doesn't seem to have as many issues with that fuel pump, but it is the same one that General Motors and Ram stopped using, because it would blow up and spread metal through the fuel system, right? So again, the Ford owners out there, which, you know, it's probably going to be a vehicle that has a few more miles on it. What are you seeing with that? You know, why do they still use that fuel pump if it was flawed? I mean, General Motors and Ram don't use it anymore. You know, again, looking at constraints, that is something with the Ford diesels, all the power stroke diesels, they still use that Bosch fuel pump. And then talking about, you know, the size of the engine, the specs on the engine, guys, this is the winner when you're talking the bore to stroke ratio, right? So the natural aspiration or the natural production of torque in this truck, this is, the bore on this truck is 3.89 inches, the stroke is 4.25. And to compare that to the GM, so 3.89 stroke in the GM to a 4.25 stroke in the Ford, this engine is under square, and that spec is super impressive for a V8 diesel, for a V8 turbo diesel, right? So bottom line is this truck has a ton more torque, which we see, you know, you're pushing 90 pound-foot more of torque out of this engine than the Duramax pushes out of theirs. And guys, so we are on the same page here. This power stroke diesel engine is the same engine since 2011 in this truck. There have been modifications, there have been tweaks, but same diesel engine since 2011, which, you know, again, 2010 and older, or 2010, that's when they had the 6.4. So this is quite the upgrade, right, over that 6.4 diesel that Ford used to make. And the Duramax, this rendition of the engine, or this, I should say this Duramax diesel engine has been around since 2017, okay? And that's basically, again, you know, some improvements, some tweaks, but same overall Duramax diesel. All right, guys, so then we say, and I guess the other thing was the fuel economy, which I did go over on the GM truck. On the Ford truck, you're gonna find fuel economy on average is 1 to 2 miles per gallon better than a General Motors. And that's really in all aspects. It's around town, it's city, that's towing. I have towed with the Fords. Actually, I towed with the Ford high output, and I got better fuel economy with that Ford high output than I do towing with the Duramax diesel, right? And the high output has a ton more horsepower and torque. So super impressed with that. I think I averaged like 10 to 11 miles a gallon with the high output pulling my 8,000 pound camper, where the Duramax, I told you I'm getting 7 to 9 in that. So the Ford diesels, these newer ones, you will get better fuel mileage than the GM Duramax. And this is again a big thing, especially when you're towing. You know, the Ford diesels will drink DEF fluid. They use a lot more DEF fluid than the Duramax diesel, than the GM diesels. And I say that, I put a lot of miles, you know, towing my camper around this summer and just driving the GM diesel, the Ford diesel. These Fords, you want to keep a jug of DEF fluid in your truck, because if you, like, they do use it a lot, you know, a lot quicker. Something with the design of the engine, the way they consume the DEF fluid, they use a lot more than a General Motors truck. So fuel tank size in these trucks, guys. This is another thing that's kind of interesting. General Motors, the only size fuel tank you can get in their Duramax diesel is a 36-gallon fuel tank. Ford, you get a 34-gallon tank, all right, on their 6.5-foot bed models. But on the 8-foot bed model, you have a 48-gallon fuel tank option, all right? And that's because the bed's longer, they can fit a bigger tank under it. I get all that, but General Motors doesn't do that, right? So again, Ford wins out with the bigger fuel tank, right? To recap on these trucks, right? The Duramax diesel, the 6.7 Power Stroke diesel, which one's better, right? Ford wins in a lot of the categories. Where they lose is that they use a lot more DEF fluid. They are not nearly as nice to drive as a General Motors truck. Otherwise, they are the winner. They have more horsepower, more torque, better fuel economy, you know, better overall engine design for torque, you know, basically for more torque, more natural torque output. A lot of winning factors there, but I will say when it comes down to it, the truck that drives the nicest to me is the truck that wins out, because you have to drive this truck every single day, right? If you're using it for work, you're using it for pleasure, you're driving 10 hours with your camper somewhere, you're going someplace, that to me is what wins out. And that's why I'm gonna choose the General Motors truck for the actual, you know, enjoyment of driving it down the road. Because I'll say this, I've driven both of the trucks. I haven't had any major issues towing with either of the trucks. I do love driving the Fords because that high output engine is a ton of fun. And, you know, there's a lot of factors, but I will say this, the actual differences are negligible, right? It's they're almost unnoticeable. When you drive a Ford truck, you will notice a little bit more power, definitely torquey. The fuel mileage thing you're gonna notice. The DEF usage you're gonna notice. But a GM truck, when you get in it, you know, it's not underpowered, like I said. None of these trucks are underpowered. You know, they can't be, otherwise they wouldn't sell them. So again, guys, here on my lot, these are my two best-selling diesel trucks, 100%. There are the differences in them. Guys, be sure to comment with any more suggestions or questions on that. Appreciate you guys watching. Click subscribe for more content.